Well, hello, my beautiful reader friends, and welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you are new here. My name is Lori Beth, and today's video is probably one of my most anticipated videos to be doing, mostly because I started my booktube channel right at the start of this year, January 2024, so I have not been able to do any fall related videos yet. Today we are doing all of my recommendations for your fall TBR, and this is going to be the one and only video that you need for your fall TBR. Well, I'd like to think so. With that being said, I do have kind of a long list of books to go over. No surprise there. So I am going to try to keep the synopsis of each one short and sweet. And I have also decided to break this into different categories so that we can kind of keep moving through things, and I will timestamp them as well so that you can kind of jump around the video. If you're only interested in maybe certain types of fall related books, then you can do that with the timestamps down below. Our categories for today are Dark Academia, Gothic, Vampiric, Witchy, and Apocalyptic. Whatever you prefer to read for the fall, whether it's warm and cozy or dark and gothic, I hope that this video will leave you with some great ideas for your fall TBR. Speaking of warm and cozy, I would like to take a minute to thank the partner of today's video, which is NovelWicks Candles. Not only is NovelWicks a small business, but this is a female-run business by a woman named Murphy who is out there making all of your bookish dreams come to fruition with the most delicious candles you have ever seen. Murphy herself is a proclaimed book lover and started this small business to allow other book lovers and really just media lovers in general to go on a sensory adventure into the worlds that we so often get to read about. I am so beyond thrilled to announce that I am going to be a rep for the fall season for this amazing company, and that you can use my code LORI10 to get yourself 10% off any order from her store. I am going to link her website here, as well as her Instagram and my Instagram, where you can go and see the drops that happen every Thursday. And you can go ahead and visit her website to see all of the candles that she currently has in stock. I am so excited because I just personally ordered from the Taylor Swift drop that happened last week. And this week, after this video comes out, is her fall season drop, and you do not want to miss these candles. You have everything from a spooky TBR to a Beetlejuice, you name it, it's gonna be in the fall drop. You don't want to miss these candles. They are beautiful, they are delicious, and they take your reading to another level. So again, use that code LORI10 for 10% off your order, and after you buy your first candle from her website, come back to this video and drop in a comment below which one you picked for yourself. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and jump right into our Dark Academia category, and first up on the list is If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. As you can see, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I had a hard time not annotating it as I was going through it. This one is very specifically heavy on the academic setting, as we follow a group of students that go to this small performing arts college, and more specifically this small group of friends that study Shakespeare. The story opens by following our main character, Oliver, who has just been released from prison, and he is recounting everything that happened during this very tragic event one night with him and his friends to the police officer that originally put him behind bars. He's kind of now coming out and saying exactly what happened. It's a very interesting story to me because it blended not just the academic setting, but the Shakespeare dialogue so heavily. Some people like that and some people don't. I really ended up enjoying it. It kind of made you feel like you were reading a little bit of a Shakespeare retelling, but it was just a story about these students, and it kind of also played into them blending the lines of reality and maybe what they were learning in school, which is kind of what led them to the tragedy happening. And I felt that as the reader as well. So I really, really liked this one. One of my favorite Dark Academia reads. And next up is Babel by R.F. Kuang. Again, very heavy on the academic setting, and also a touch of fantasy involved in this as well. Much more academic forward than fantasy forward. So if you are someone who likes a little bit of a heavier, denser book that is more, it reads a little bit more like like a textbook that you would read in college, but it does still have a very prominent story and again, a touch of magic as well, which makes it kind of a really interesting premise, a little well-rounded, I guess, if you will. This one is set in Oxford in 1836 and follows our main character, Robin, who has been adopted by this basically by this old white man who lives and works in Oxford. And he basically raises Robin as this academic prodigy and gets him ready to go to Oxford when he is old enough and join Babel, which is the linguistic society. So once he gets there, a couple of things come forward. Robin is from Canton, so he is not a white person in this college, and he sees very clearly some of the racism that is going on in the school at this time. He also has a few female classmates as well, and he sees kind of how they are treated in the grand scheme of things. It's kind of like old money, old boys club type school setting. And then again, some magic kind of starts to come into play as the story goes on. I really, really liked this. It does read much drier and again, kind of dense like a textbook. But if you like academic novels or an academic setting, this is very atmospheric and it gives you like that touch of magic, which almost makes it feel more of like a magical realism as opposed to like an academic fantasy novel, if that makes sense. Love, love, love. I also love R.F. Kuang as an author, so I'm a big fan of this book too. And a very, very atmospheric, beautifully written dark academia novel that blew me out of the water last year was A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. This is definitely more of a YA novel, but still very gripping and again, kind of atmospheric. And that's what I loved about it so much. This follows a main character who, again, is in a college where she deals with a lot of sexism because of being a female in an academic setting. She has always wanted to be part of the literature college that she attends, but they don't allow women at this time. So she applies to the architecture school and then gets in. As she's in the architecture school, she sees that the family of one of her all-time favorite authors has put on this competition to hire a young architect to come and help revamp this dilapidated house that the author's family owns on the seaside cliff somewhere. She enters the competition. Of course, she wins. She goes to the house and a bunch of mysteries and magic start to unfold. This was just beautifully atmospheric. Like the way that Ava Reid writes, I swear as I was reading this, I could smell salt. Like you felt like the pages were covered in salt. Everything was damp. The house itself was falling apart, but was still somehow so whimsical and you kind of wanted to be there. And then the story itself was very mysterious and kind of went in a direction I didn't expect it to. I love, love, love this book in general, mostly because of the atmospheric setting. I would say it's not super academic in the sense of it's not set at their school. Mostly it is set at this house that she goes to try and work on. But the academic part of it is still a very big part of the storyline, mostly considering because she is a female trying to be part of something that she is not allowed to be a part of, which also gives it kind of a beautiful flow as well, because you get to see this young woman fight for a lot of things that she really wants. Very, very beautifully written. And finally, bringing this category in for a landing with probably not only my favorite dark academia novel, but one of my favorite books of all time, and that is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. And also, I've shown this book off a few times, but this is one of my most favorite books that I own because I love the size of it. It's such a cool edition. There's many, many editions of this book out, which I also think is kind of unique. But this one in particular I grabbed because it kind of reminded me of like those old like mystery novels or like romance novels that you could just get at the grocery store. I just love it so much. I also love the color of it. But anyways, Leigh Bardugo is probably one of my all-time favorite authors. I just love the way she writes. So in Ninth House, we follow a main character named Alex, who has kind of grown up with this gift of being able to see and sense and interact with dead people, ghosts, if you will. She has not always dealt with it in the best way and doesn't know how to talk to anybody in her life about it. So as she starts to get older, she falls in with a sketchy group of kids and starts to self-medicate to deal with having this special gift. This leads her down a road of heavy alcohol and drug use, and she awakes one day to this tragedy that had happened when she was completely passed out, and she does not know what to do with her life. The morning after this tragedy occurs, she wakes up in the hospital, not really knowing exactly what went down, but she is introduced to someone who works at Yale University, and she is offered an opportunity to go there on a full-ride scholarship if she agrees to help them in their secret society with the special talent that she has of communicating with the dead. She is kind of whisked away to the opposite coast of the country and starts this life at a very prestigious university. Again, old boys club, old money type of setting, and she feels definitely a little bit out of her league. However, she is very smart and very witty and very cunning, and she quickly falls into this secret society world and starts to develop a relationship with a couple of the other members. It takes much more of a paranormal turn than I expected it to, but in a very gripping way. I felt like this book was a page turner. Like, I wanted to know what was going to happen every time I put the book down. Like, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not only that, it is so heavily academic. Like, you are set at Yale. Like, she is in a dorm room. She's walking through campus. She's describing the buildings. She's describing the weather. You can just see yourself there in October with a pumpkin spice latte and a chilly breeze in the air and coming across these secret societies. It feels real. And I think that's what I liked about it the most, is that you know Yale exists, and if you went and visited it right now, you would probably run into Alex and the secret societies. At least in my head. That's what I think. But again, this is probably my favorite dark academia book ever, still to this day, and one of my favorite books of all time. Ninth House, Leigh Bardugo. Love, love, love. All right, we are moving on to our Gothic category. And first up in this category, starting off with an author that you might not have ever heard of, JK, LOL, it's Leigh Bardugo. And her latest release, The Familiar. So this is definitely a little different for Leigh Bardugo because it was her first dip into a historical fantasy, but it did not disappoint. And the reason I put this in the Gothic category is because of the setting of this story itself. This is set in the Golden Age of Spain. So we're talking Spanish Inquisition time, and it follows a main character who is a scullion, which is kind of like a housemaid for a family in this society. The family she works for is not necessarily very prominent in the social rankings, but they are constantly trying to work their way up the social ladder. The mistress of this house discovers that the main character, Lucia, has the ability to create magic, or little miracles as they call them, and she starts to use her almost as like a jester. She starts to have dinner parties and invites people over just to watch their maid create these little miracles, and she quickly becomes well known, and very shortly, Lucia becomes sought after by some very important people. So not only does the story technically revolve around witchcraft and magic, the setting is so Gothic, and she describes everything so well, down to like the houses that everybody lives in. Think of old, beautiful, rich Spanish households with beautiful gardens. She talks about the weather a couple of times in the book. Like, she very specifically says it's turning into fall, like the leaves are changing, the weather is cooling off. So you already feel like you're set in this beautiful autumnal background. And then there's also witchcraft and magic involved as well. This was really, really good, and I highly recommend this if you lean more towards historical type stories. maybe you don't necessarily love fantasy, this doesn't feel too heavy on the fantasy. It feels much more historical in the sense like you could almost be reading about, if magic was real, a family member and the story of their life. I loved this one so much. All right, next in our Gothic category is House of Hollow by Crystal Sutherland. And I read this last year, I believe, just when the weather was cooling off and it was just starting to get like a little bit darker outside. The leaves were starting to change and it was so perfect for the time of year. It made me want to reread it this year, like at about the same time. I'm going to read the back of this book for you so I can give you a better synopsis of what the story is about, so I don't go and butcher it like I typically do, just babbling on. Iris Hollow and her two older sisters are unquestionably strange. As children, they disappeared on a Scottish city street, only to return a month later with no memory of where they've been or what had happened to them. More troubling, their appearance began to change. Their blue eyes, now black, their dark hair, now white. And as they grew older, odd, eerie occurrences seemed to follow in their wake. People find them disturbingly intoxicating, unbearably beautiful, and inexplicably dangerous. Now, 17-year-old Iris is doing all she can to fit in and graduate high school on time, something her two famous, glamorous, globe-trotting older sisters, Gray and Vivi, never managed to do. But when Gray goes missing, leaving behind bizarre clues as to her whereabouts, Iris and Vivi are left to find her, but they aren't the only ones looking. As they brush against the supernatural, Iris quickly realizes that the story she's been told about their past is unraveling, and the world that returned them seemingly unharmed 10 years ago might just be calling them back. I'll take a moment of applause for my dramatic synopsis reading. So as you can tell, the story itself just has a very dark Gothic vibe to it. Not to mention, like, look at the cover of this book. How can you not be drawn to this? And I want to put this in even more of a subcategory of like earthy Gothic, because throughout this story, as you start to learn about the sisters and their abilities and what they can do, a lot of elemental stuff is involved. So a lot of things maybe growing where they shouldn't grow, growing from dead things or dead bugs, dead plants, and then things blooming to life around them. And very supernatural and kind of spooky as well. This is technically a YA novel, but I remember reading it feeling like a little unnerved and a little like, ooh, like jumpy, like I didn't know what was going to happen next. And I liked this whole idea of them kind of disappearing and then reappearing. No one knows what happened. They don't know what happened. And then as they go through the story, trying to find their eldest sister, they very quickly learn exactly what happened that fateful night that they disappeared and where their lives are going to lead from it. This was a very unique story to me. And again, perfect for like that spooky season vibe. It kind of actually made me a little bit scared at sometimes. And I don't know, it was just kind of perfectly everything, and I loved it so, so much. And next in our Gothic category is Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. Sorry, the lights kind of really reflect on this beautiful edition. Look at this cover. I love these clear plastic covers. So as the name of this story implies, this does revolve around a house, and more specifically, this giant, creepy, Gothic house in the middle of this small town named Eden. In this small town, we follow our main character, Opal, who is this really kind of like rough around the edges, like cutthroat alley cat girl. That's what she reminds me of. She's very scrappy. And she is taking care of her younger brother who is just about to graduate high school. And it is her sole responsibility to make sure that he can make it through his last years in school and get him somewhere safely to go to college and kind of like out of this small town world that they live in. Opal works a bunch of dead-end jobs and doesn't usually make a ton of money. And as she's walking home one night from her job, she stumbles across the Starling house and something calls to her from the house. She kind of stops at the gate because it is gated, like people can't just go up to the house. And as she's there, she has a run-in with the owner of the home. One thing leads to another, and he ends up offering her a job to be the housekeeper of this house and clean it from top to bottom. And there's some reason why she is so drawn to and connected to this house as well as the owner. As the story unfolds, she starts to see that this house is much more than just like this old creepy house on the hill. It has kind of like a sense to it, like a feeling. It is a sentient house that kind of pushes and pulls back on her. And as she spends more and more time there, she realizes that the owner of the home is not just there to protect the house, but to protect the city that they live in from things that kind of happen around the house. This, again, was very, very Gothic feeling. The way they described this house, it just made me think of like the Addams Family house. That's kind of like what I had in my mind when I was reading it. And I didn't know that I would enjoy a story so much about a place or like a home like that. I thought it was a really unique like layer to the story. So not only did I have the main character, the relationship that she started to develop with the owner of the house, but the house itself and the two of them kind of coming together within this house. It was a very beautifully written story. I think Alex E. Harrow is a really brilliant writer. And if you like stories about sentient houses, this one will be right up your alley. All right, hang with me in the Gothic category for a little bit longer because we are going to talk about Belladonna by Adeline Grace. Look at this cover. Aren't these so pretty? But speaking of the cover, and as you can kind of see, this one leans more towards that earthy Gothic vibe. And I wanted to read the synopsis of this one for you as well because, again, sometimes I can't always like reiterate the synopsis of a story on my own. So, orphaned as a baby, 19-year-old Signa has been raised by a string of guardians, each more interested in her wealth than her well-being, and each has met an untimely end. Her remaining relatives are the elusive Hawthorns, an eccentric family living at Thorn Grove, an estate both glittering and gloomy. Its patriarch mourns his late wife through wild parties, while his son grapples for control of the family's waning reputation, and his daughter suffers from a mysterious illness. But when their mother's restless spirit appears claiming she was poisoned, Signa realizes that the family she depends on could be in grave danger and enlists the help of a surly stable boy to hunt down the killer. However, Signa's best chance of uncovering the murderer is an alliance with Death himself, a fascinating, dangerous shadow who has never been far from her side. Though he's made her life a living hell, Death shows Signa that their growing connection may be more powerful and more irresistible than she ever dared imagine. So, I mean, so many beautiful things in that synopsis. Signa, our main character, has always kind of been kissed by death or touched by death, quite literally. So since she's a baby, people in her life have always had these untimely deaths and have kind of just left her to fend for herself and passed her to the next family member. And she's just kind of biding her time until she's old enough to collect her estate from what her parents have left her. As she starts to go on this journey to solve what happened to her aunt, she starts to learn that people aren't always who they say they are, and she kind of starts to uncover some things about her own family that she did not see happening. Also, she starts to make this really deep connection with death. She discovers that she can consume belladonna, so poisonous berries, and make herself just pass through the other side enough to start having full-on like interactions with death, so much so that they kind of start to blend the lines of everything, and she develops like a full relationship with him. Like, he is a shadow daddy in this book. And if you are into that kind of like slow burn, let me tell you, this book does not disappoint. And the atmosphere of this book itself was enough to just make me want more. She is living in these grandiose estates with these families. It gives off Bridgerton vibes because this is kind of a time in her life where she's like a young woman coming into society. They're having parties, they're having balls, she has a dance card. And it ended up being like a really cool blend of all of these different things with that little bit of like Pride and Prejudice, Bridgerton type vibe to it as well. The sequel to this, Foxglove, was just as good as the first one, and the third book just came out, and I do have that on my personal fall TBR, so I can't wait to finish the story and see what happens with Signa and Death. All right, so we are coming in for a landing in our Gothic category with probably one of my all-time favorite books again, and part of my all-time favorite duologies, which is One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig, and this is the first out of 2 books in the Shepherd King duology. This took a Gothic vibe to a level I didn't realize that I was missing in my life. Not only is the atmosphere of this book so dark and whimsical, but the magic system in the story is unmatched from anything I have ever read before. So in the story, we follow our main character named Elspeth Spindle, and she lives in this world called Blunder, where there's almost like a dark magic curse over the entire world that they live in. So magic does exist in this world, but technically to be able to use magic, you need to be holding or using one of these cards that comes from like this magical deck that was created like hundreds of years ago that kind of started this whole curse in the first place. This deck of cards feels very similar to like a tarot card deck where there's different types of cards within the deck and a certain amount of those different types of cards. So there could be like 5 cards of like the Chalice Cup and 6 cards of like the Maiden card. And depending on what that card is, whoever is holding that card can make the magic of that card happen. So like if you're holding the Maiden card, it would make you look super beautiful to everybody around you, kind of basically just like puts an Instagram filter on you IRL, stuff like that. Technically, if you do not have one of these cards, you should not be able to use magic, and if you can, you are considered diseased and you have to basically just be put to death, which is pretty dramatic. So our main character, Elspeth, is of course hiding the fact that she does have magical abilities, but this magic did technically come from a card years and years ago when she tried to use like the main card of the deck, which was the Shepherd card, and it like transferred into her, and now this Shepherd King has basically been a monster living in her head since she's a little girl, and she has had to hide this about herself her entire life growing up. There's this group of vigilantes, if you will, that are trying to reunite this entire deck of card and break the curse over Blunder, and Elspeth kind of becomes involved with them and tries to help them on their mission and accomplish lifting this curse from the world that they live in. Along the way, a bunch of mysterious things start happening. Elspeth and one of the highwaymen start to develop a relationship, and also she's constantly fighting with this monster that lives in her head and is always talking to her and kind of like interacting with her in her life. It was very like kind of like a very lush, delicious story in such a Gothic setting. All of these beautiful little pieces kind of coming together. The world that they lived in, the magic system was so unique. This slow burn romance that kind of starts to develop. And not to mention again, this is a duology, which is one of my favorite things to read. I don't always think that we need 16 book series to make a good series. I think that if you can package up a story in 2 books tops, that is more than enough for me. So not only did I love the first book in this series, I loved the second book as well. And this is perfect for those dark, cool, spooky season nights, especially if you love very, very unique magic. All right, hang in there with me. We are moving on to our next category, which is Vampiric, and starting with A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. You've heard me talk about this book time and time again. This was probably one of my favorite books that I read last year, and I just thought it was a perfect spooky season vibe. Like if you like vampires, but you want something on the adult side of things, look no further. This is everything you have been wanting in a book. So the story itself follows a bride of Dracula named Constanta, and it follows her from the time that she is turned into a vampire over centuries of being with Dracula and starting this family that they kind of develop over centuries and centuries. So it starts off with just him and her, and she's very secluded, like in Dracula's castle, and all she really knows is what he allows her to experience. And then over time, he starts to bring in some different consorts into their family. So as time goes on, they start to develop this very unique family dynamic and this really intense love for each other. This is written in letters. So these are technically letters from Constanta, like either in her journal, her diary, what have you, to Dracula. And they never say his name ever in this book. It says it on the back, but you just kind of assume that's like the big vampire guy. That's who we're talking about, is Dracula. But it was really interesting because you follow this woman who is introduced to this whole new world, right? She doesn't know how to be a vampire. She doesn't know anything about vampires. She is only allowed so much knowledge, and she just kind of has to go off of what Dracula tells her. But as centuries and time goes on, she starts to learn and she starts to grow. And by the end of the book, this woman is going to fight for what she wants and for what she believes is right. And that might just be the demise of her family. Dun dun dun. It's like this very romantic story and so delicious and definitely very, very steamy. Again, if you want an adult novel about vampires, look no further. Also, trigger warnings for this book. There is obviously a lot of grotesque things when it comes to vampires and the way that they interact with other living things. There's also a lot of sexual content, some consensual, some non-consensual, and just a lot of mental and physical abuse at times. So trigger warnings on this book, but if you want like a very dark tale, this story is so beautiful. All right, only one more book in the vampiric category, and that is An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson. Another vampire book by the same author, except this one is a Carmilla retelling and set in a much different time than A Dowry of Blood. So I didn't mention that. A Dowry of Blood is very much like, I don't know what century that's set in, 1600, 1500, even earlier than that. Old Dracula time. This is more like 1950s, 60s, like East Coast United States setting. But with that being said, it is an academic novel on top of it being about vampires. And not just about vampires, but a retelling of Carmilla herself. We follow a main character, Laura, who at the start of the book is already feeling like a little bit out of her element because she's only ever lived in the small town that she comes from. And she goes all the way to the East Coast to join this girls' college that is very exclusive and very highly competitive as far as academics go. She wants to be a poetry student and joins this poetry class by this like renowned poetry teacher that everybody wants attention from, including one of her main pupils, who is Carmilla. Carmilla and Laura all like right out of the gate don't get along, mostly because Laura has already kind of caught the eye of this poetry professor, and Carmilla likes to be the center of attention. As the story goes on, Laura and Carmilla do become very close to this poetry professor, and the dynamic between all three of them starts to shift and change over time. Laura becomes much more of a prominent character. She starts to stand on her own 2 feet, and Carmilla kind of undergoes this very life-changing event. Without giving too much away, I think you know what I mean. And that changes things even further. It was a really beautiful sapphic story. I liked watching these girls kind of work their way through young adulthood and then start to deal with young adulthood with this big life change that happens to Carmilla on top of it. They are kind of, I don't want to say taken advantage of, but they look up to this teacher so much that they kind of fall under her spell, and she kind of uses her influence over them to control their actions and everything that they're doing. So at the beginning of the book, you see that Carmilla is this girl that is very stubborn and very much wants to be the center of attention, in the spotlight at all times, and Laura is kind of meek and mild. And as all of this stuff happens, again, that dynamic changes and you get to see them kind of switch gears and kind of switch positions in this relationship hierarchy. I really thought it was cool. I liked seeing like these vampires in the academic setting. I think that's one of the cool things I love the most about reading about vampires is they're so old, right? They've been living for centuries, and the knowledge that they have and the knowledge that they can bring to younger people and younger generations. I also do find it very intriguing, the whole idea of how people become vampires and how vampires make other vampires and how they live amongst us and how they live their lives. It was another very romantic story, and I really appreciate that about S.T. Gibson's writing. Just really full of desire and love and growth. And if you do enjoy sapphic stories, this one, in my opinion, was just a really beautifully written one. All right, so we are moving on to our next category, which is the witchy category, and a book that I honestly couldn't stop talking about when I read it last fall, and a book that I am so excited to be able to talk about again. Like, do I need another excuse to talk about it? But that is Slewfoot by Bram. I mean, look at the cover of this book. And also just the layout of it, like the shape of it. It is a very large book. So here's just like your normal book. It's like big and square, and it has a beautiful matte cover. This is just the copy I got from Barnes & Noble. So not only is Bram an author, he is an illustrator as well. And the other amazing aspect of this book is that it comes with illustrations of the characters. So, I mean, look at that. As you are reading, you can go and reference these pictures, and it kind of just helps bring into the forefront of your mind exactly what he envisioned them to look like, clearly because he put it on paper, but it just kind of like brings something different to the story itself. And again, the synopsis is pretty brief, so I'm just going to read that on the back so that I can give you the general idea of this story. So, set in colonial New England, Slewfoot is a tale of magic and mystery, of triumph and terror from acclaimed author and artist Bram. An ancient spirit awakens in a dark wood. The wild folk call him Father, Slayer, Protector. The colonists call him Slewfoot, Demon, Devil. To Abatha, a recently widowed outcast, alone and vulnerable in her pious village, he is the only one she can turn to for help. Together they ignite a battle between pagan and Puritan, one that threatens to destroy the entire village, leaving nothing but ashes and bloodshed in its wake. So as you can tell from the synopsis, this is like puritanical village and how they feel about witchcraft and women in particular that have inclinations to witchcraft. So we're following this young woman named Abatha. She is originally from England, and she is basically forced into marriage with this man in this New England colony in the United States. She doesn't know anybody. She's completely by herself, and she has to just start life as a wife and the wife of a farmer in a world that she knows nothing about. Shortly into the story, her husband does pass away. So not only is she just a single woman on her own, she's a single woman that is trying to fight for what is hers, which is the land and the farm that her husband left her. It is a very classic setting of that kind of like Puritan village time, like Salem witch trial vibes. It is so perfect for Halloween and spooky vibes. It is the story of a woman who, without even having really done anything, is starting to be accused of such things like witchcraft. But as the story unfolds, you start to see that she is maybe capable of things that people didn't technically think she could do. The main forefront of the story seems like it is just like a woman fighting these accusations of being a witch in these Puritan times, but it's so much more than that. Abatha was this brilliant character who was so far ahead of her time. in this day and age, right? Women don't have the right to anything. She doesn't even have the right to the land that her own husband owned before he died. And she spends this entire story fighting for everything that she thinks is hers. I thought it was just a very like feminist take on these witchcraft, like pagan village times, and not to mention the relationship that she starts to develop with Slewfoot himself. He's not a shadow daddy, but he's like
a demon daddy?
I don't know, but I was completely in awe of this story. I feel like it was a beautiful, dark fantasy, but also brought like that historical vibe, and it was just perfect for like a Halloween book to read. All right, next up in our witchy category is a book I am so glad I was able to experience in the fall last year, and that is Morgan Is My Name by Sophie Keach. Again, I want to read the back of the book for you because this is a retelling and I don't want to like butcher anything too greatly with my own synopsis. Young Morgan of Cornwall lives a happy life until King Uther Pendragon, with the help of the sorcerer Merlin, murders her father and tricks her mother into marriage. Furious, brilliant, and vengeful, Morgan defies her brutal stepfather, taking up a secret education, discovering a lifelong affinity with the healing arts, and falling in love with a man far beneath her station. Used as a bargaining chip in her stepfather's war games, Morgan finds herself banished to a world of isolated and gossiping courts amidst the machinations of kings, sorcerers, and men. But some desires are not easily forgotten, and the search for her independence is a quest Morgan cannot give up. As the era of King Arthur approaches, she must use all her wit, knowledge, and courage to fight against those who wish to deny her intelligence, crush her spirit, and control her body. But in seeking her freedom, Morgan risks losing everything: her reputation, her loved ones, and her life. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's kind of an epic tale, and an epic tale, again, with a feminist take on it. This brought to the forefront another woman who was living in a time that she just simply did not belong. She had a brain, she had thoughts, she had feelings, and as the synopsis describes, she comes from this line of women that have an affinity for healing and for maybe some magical elements. It was a really interesting take on watching everything unfold from a female perspective, all the way from being a young woman who tries to garner an education for herself to getting married and trying to have a voice in this marriage and also keep her family from this demise of like this evil king who basically changed her entire world. And as you heard, Merlin does happen to be a part of the story as well. So we're talking King Arthur, Merlin, Morgan of Cornwall. The way the book is written itself also just felt very informative and important to be reading. Like, I felt like I was reading a true story of this woman, and I needed to see how she handled it and got stuff done and became the woman that she was, like everything that she went through. I think that Sophie Keach is an absolutely brilliant writer, and I'm really excited to read more from her. But this one in particular just gave me a very fall vibe. I think mostly because of the setting that we're in, but it was just great for like a cold, rainy fall day. All right, friends, so we have one more book in our witchy category, and that is Wayward by Amelia Hart. So this book does follow 3 different POVs, and each POV is from a woman in this family. It is really cool because it is across centuries of time, starting all the way back in like the 1600s to present day, and then kind of in the middle, and I think it was like, what was it, 1940s, so right around World War II era. It's really interesting because each character, like when you're with them and their POV, is recounting what is happening like in their present day, like in the political climate, in the world, and a very interpersonal issue that they are dealing with and trying to come to terms with. This also revolves around a home or a cottage that belongs to the earliest woman in the POV, and throughout the timeline you find each woman ending up at this cottage and finding little bits and pieces from the woman that previously lived there. It gives off this very female forward narrative. Clearly, this is about women, more specifically women within one family, and also what these women are dealing with because of being female. And each woman in this story does also have an inclination to be able to use magic. So it's another tale of female witches throughout history of a family and the connection that kind of brings them all together at the end of the day. Amelia Hart is a very gripping writer. Like, her narrative is very easy to fall into. The fact that she could weave together like 3 different POVs was very impressive in my opinion. I don't think that's easy to do. And when it's not done well, it feels very dismantled and kind of hard to follow. But in a book where it's done right, like this one, the story just flows so easily and you kind of get lost in between the stories of all the women, but in a way that just kind of like makes them meld together. The magic was really beautiful. The family bond that was kind of in the forefront of the story was really lovely to read about. And I just liked that it was another story about like the strength and the resilience of women, especially when it comes to surrounding like women and the history of women with witchcraft. I went into this book thinking this was going to be just like kind of a fun, witchy read, but it was much more than that. It was kind of poignant. At some points, the story was actually kind of heart-wrenching, but as the story unfolded and you saw this bond between these 3 different generations of women kind of start to unfold, everything kind of started to come together at the end, and it was truly just a beautiful, spellbinding story to fall into. All right, we have one more book to go over, and it is a standalone in its own category, and that is the apocalyptic category. I don't read a lot of books that kind of fall into this genre, but I just last month read one that had been on my radar for a little while, and I finally saw it at one of my local bookstores and grabbed it because it sounded so interesting to me, and that is It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over by Anne DeMarkin. So once again, I am going to read the synopsis because even though this book is kind of teeny tiny, it packs a punch, and I feel like if I just try to explain it to you, I'm not going to do it well, so let's go in with the synopsis. It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over asks, how much of yourself can you lose before you are lost? And then what happens? The heroine of this haunting spare novel is voraciously alive in the afterlife. Adrift, yet keenly aware, our undead narrator notes every bizarre detail of her new reality. She has forgotten even her name, but she remembers with unbearable longing the place where she knew herself and was known, where she loved and was loved. She heads west and into mind-boggling adventures, carrying a dead, opinionated crow in her chest. It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over is one of the sharpest and funniest novels of recent years. A tale for our dispossessed times. This is technically a book about a zombie. And I kind of gathered that when I read it, but I don't think I fully grasped that just from the back of the book. I just felt like it was such a beautiful snapshot of what this tiny book was going to be about. So we're never introduced to our main character by name because, as it states, she wakes up and she doesn't even remember what her name is. But she has all these random memories about her life. She knows that she's been in love. She's longing for it. She's longing for the person, but she doesn't know who the person is or what their name is. She's surrounded by other zombies, and she kind of lives in this little community and is trying to find her way in this new world that she lives in. She does still exist amongst other humans, so it's kind of like this post-apocalyptic zombie apocalypse world where zombies and humans are walking amongst each other. But this isn't just your like Walking Dead situation. These zombies are still very cognizant and can talk and function. So it was really just an interesting take on things because she's technically undead. Like, she loses her arm at the very beginning of the book. Like, it just like falls off because she's like a dead body. And she tries to like keep it like in her shirt and stuff for a while because she just doesn't want to lose it. She doesn't want to lose one more thing from her human life. And it's just very, very deeply human without being human, if that makes sense. It's like she has all this time to think and be alive without being alive. Kind of pondering like what she's missing from her past life and what she's gonna do, like what she's seeking. So she goes off, she just starts trekking across the country of wherever she's at until she reaches the end. And it was very eye-opening, very, very weird, and kind of grotesque at times because she's still a zombie, so she lives kind of like a zombie, and she just walks through and experiences all these different things from a completely different point of view. I actually couldn't believe how much I enjoyed this little book. It was so easy to read. You really just felt like this zombie person was just like spitting out everything they were thinking in the moment. And I ate it up. Like I just wanted to know what was gonna happen, like where she was gonna go. Are we gonna know who she is? Is she gonna find this love of her life that she can't remember who they are? And I just couldn't put the book down. I mean, it's a very, very short, easy read. It's 120 pages, so I read it in a day. So if you're looking for something that is just a little off the wall, but still gives like that spooky, creepy vibe because it's got kind of like a dark undertone of zombies like consuming people and like losing limbs. It was really interesting and it was much deeper than I expected it to be for such a short novel. I've never read anything by Anne DeMarkin before, and I'm kind of excited to see what else she has out there. Well, there you have it, my friends. Those are all of the books that I recommend for your fall TBR. And again, these are all books that I have read. I want to thank you so much for hanging in there with me because we just went over, I think it was 16 books total, and that is no small feat, my friends. With that being said, I would love to know if you have read any of the books that we talked about in today's video. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on those books in a comment down below. Or is there something on your fall TBR that you think I should have on my radar? Let me know that in a comment down below as well. As always, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button because it always helps a girl out. And if you want to make sure you don't miss any of my other upcoming videos, go ahead and hit that subscribe button too. Please also don't forget to check out NovelWicks candles. I will link her website down below, and you can use that code Lori10 for 10% off your order. As always, it has been an absolute blast, and I can't wait to see you guys in the next one.